Thanks, Chris, and thanks to you for tuning in. Tonight's lead, a divided jury. 4 days after George Zimmerman was set free, cracks are appearing in the jury that brought back a unanimous verdict of not guilty. Last night in an interview on CNN, the woman known as Juror B37 said she thought Trayvon Martin was partially responsible for his own death.
I believe he played a huge role in his death. He could have, when George confronted him, and he could have walked away and gone home. He didn't have to do whatever he did and come back and be in a fight.
In an earlier portion of that interview, she also seemed to accept George Zimmerman's account of what happened.
I think George Zimmerman is a man whose heart was in the right place. I think pretty much it happened the way George said it happened. George had a right to protect himself at that point. I had no doubt George feared for his life.
Immediately after that interview aired last night, 4 other jurors released a statement saying, quote, "The opinions of Juror B37 expressed on the Anderson Cooper show were her own and not in any way representative of the jurors listed below. They added, the death of a teenager weighed heavily on our hearts, but in the end, we did what the law required us to do." Juror B37 responded this morning with her own statement, quote, "For reasons of my own, I needed to speak alone." She went on to say, quote, "No other family should be forced to endure what the Martins family has endured. My prayers are with Trayvon's parents for their loss, as they have always been." Tonight, all this deepens the mystery surrounding the trial. What was going on in that jury room? How did they reach a verdict? And were they ever really on the same page? With me now is my all-star panel, legal prosecutor former prosecutor Faith Jenkins, defense attorney Ken Padowitz, and veteran prosecutor Paul Henderson. Thank you for all being here. Let me ask you.
Absolutely.
Let me ask you, what do you make of these jurors releasing their statements so soon after Juror B37's interview?
Well, I think B37 spoke a lot about what happened in the jury room and their discussions in the jury room, and made some very strong statements. Because based on what she said, they didn't just reject the fact that the prosecution didn't prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. She fully accepted the defense story and George Zimmerman's story in his statements, even though he didn't take the witness stand. For me, it appeared that she either had a predisposition to believe the defense before she ever heard the evidence, or the defense did a really, really good job. I think only she knows the answer to that, but I thought the interview was very telling.
Now, Ken, it was interesting to me that she said that Trayvon could have gone home even after George Zimmerman confronted him. What was interesting is she seemed to put the responsibility on Trayvon Martin, and she also conceded that she believed that, in fact, Zimmerman was the one that confronted him or started it, which is very interesting given the verdict she came with. And when you deal with the fact that she cited stand your ground, I mean, didn't Trayvon Martin have the right then not to retreat if you're dealing with a stand your ground kind of thought, which she gave in the interview? It's a very interesting statement given other things she said in the interview.
Well, this juror clearly bought the hook, line, and sinker statements by George Zimmerman. I mean, she bought all of it. It's clear from her statements. We don't have to speculate. And based on those statements, she believed everything Zimmerman had to say. So her belief was that, therefore, the responsibility, or some of the responsibility, lied with the kid who was just a few days earlier had been 16 years old and had been walking talking on his cell phone and had a bag of candy. So, you know, the problem with this juror, if we went back to jury selection, the fact that this juror said that peaceful protesting was rioting should have been a clear indication to the prosecution that this juror had to be struck. But the juror was not. This is what happened in history, and we have this verdict. But clearly, these statements are from someone who buys every statement by the defendant, and that's one of the failings of the prosecution, that they put these statements into evidence on their side of the case. Those statements should never have come in. They were hearsay statements and not admissible.
Let me go to you, Paul, because I want to ask another thing. And again, the jury has spoken. We accept the jury's verdict, but she has come out and said things that I think we've got to discuss since she decided to discuss them. She said, and I played it, that Trayvon Martin played a huge part. Her words, not mine. Her emphasis, not mine. A huge role in his own death. How do you react to that? I mean, how does that hit you?
Well, it makes it clear to me what her perspective is and what her approach was in this case. I'm going to take it a little step farther than what we were just talking about and point out the fact that specifically in talking about the stand your ground, that she says that she used and the rest of the jurors used as one of the tools to help them figure out the law. It wasn't just an issue that stand your ground law existed. It only applied to George Zimmerman and not to Trayvon Martin at all. So it wasn't an indication that could have gone 50-50, and it wasn't just that she adopted the defense perspective. It was that perspective was excluded from association to Trayvon Martin, that he had no right to exercise stand your ground, that he had no right when confronted her words to do anything. Right. And then when you hear her when she's talking about Trayvon Martin in a very judgmental way from things that she inferred throughout the trial, saying that he was mad, saying that he was responsible for his own death, it just makes it very clear to me the lens that she used as she listened to the evidence and she heard the testimony, and it makes it very challenging, I think, for that prosecution team to have broken through that perspective and broken through that approach, to have really identified what the facts were in a way that would have been persuasive for a different outcome.
Let me bring in former prosecutor Marcia Clark. She's also author of Killer Ambition. Marcia, thank you for joining us. Let me pose the same question to you. Juror B37 says Trayvon Martin played a huge role in his own death. How do you respond to that?
I think it's really clear that she bought the defense hook, line, and sinker. She blames Trayvon Martin for having fought with George Zimmerman and therefore believes that George Zimmerman had the right to shoot him. And it shows to me that she threw out so much of the prosecution's testimony, especially that of Rachel Jeantel. What happened to that? Rachel Jeantel testified that she overheard Trayvon Martin saying, "Why are you following me for?" Heard somebody else who had to be Zimmerman saying, "What are you doing here?" And then later heard Trayvon Martin saying, "Get off me, get off me." What does that mean to her? Where did that go? That was completely dismissed by her as though it never happened. So it seems to me she completely dismissed Rachel Jeantel, a pivotal witness for the prosecution. And of course, if you do that, if you dismiss the prosecution's evidence, especially key evidence like that, then what else are you going to do? You're going to buy the defense. This juror struck me as somebody who came in with a defense bias right from the start and then stuck to that agenda all the way through the trial.
And Faith, what was interesting is she said, after George confronted him, she's not even debating that George Zimmerman started the confrontation. So why wouldn't she think that Trayvon Martin had the right to respond? I mean, to say he should have just gone home.
Right. There's a certain level of what she said, certain statements. There's a certain level of denial in what she said, because she also said that race was not an issue here at all. It was not even discussed in the jury room. And if George Zimmerman had seen anyone of any race, he probably would have stopped them. And anyone watching this trial and looking at the statements that George Zimmerman made in his history about the young black men that he called the police on numerous times knows that that's simply not true. So the way that she looked at this trial and she looked at the evidence, she accepted the defense outright, and she also was in denial denial about certain things.
Now, Ken, when you also hear juror B37, she said she only had one option as a juror, and that was to acquit George Zimmerman. Watch this.
They gave us the laws, and we went by the laws, and that's how we found him innocent. They would have given us manslaughter, and everything that was attached to it, it would have come out the exact same way. It was just so confusing what went with what and what we could apply to what. And after hours and hours and hours of deliberating over the law and reading it over and over and over again, we decided there's just no other place to go.
Now, she said there was bad, it was confusing, it was the law. I mean, was it bad law or bad lawyering, Ken?
Well, it was a combination of both. I mean, there's clearly some major errors the prosecution made in this case. And you have bad law. You have the stand your ground law, which I've said repeatedly on your program is an abomination. It's a horrible law. It brings us back to the Old West. And, you know, you shoot to kill and ask questions later. So it's bad law and very bad strategy on the part of the prosecution by putting in George Zimmerman's statements, by telling the jury that race had nothing to do with this. I mean, we have to respect this verdict. But clearly the juror did have another alternative. They could have given some weight or zero weight to George Zimmerman. They didn't have to give him all the weight. That was their decision. And that's what we give jurors. We give them the power to how much weight goes to evidence. But they could have discounted George Zimmerman's testimony, and they could have come up with a different verdict.
Now, Paul, how do you take the fact that when she said the statement about Trayvon Martin had a huge role in what happened, that the other jurors, all but one, came out immediately denouncing her? Does that say anything to you about...
It absolutely does.
Okay.
It absolutely does. So it says two things to me. One, it makes it very clear that those jurors felt strong enough that they needed to be proactive in making sure that they distanced themselves from the communications that she's made so publicly. And the fact that they are emphasizing the fact that they were more sympathetic to the victim, I think that's very telling and important because it's clear that that's part of what the message is that they want people to understand, that they were more sympathetic than what they heard their fellow juror communicating when she was on television.
All right, my legal panel is going to stay with me. Lots more to talk about. Coming up, who is she? We've heard from 5 of the 6 jurors, but what about the final one? Was she the whole to convict George Zimmerman? Plus my interview with Rachel Gentel. She knew the Zimmerman defense team for months before the trial. How she says they tried to fight her testimony.
The defense never wanted me there. Best way to say it, they had a plan for me.
You're not going to want to miss the rest of what she has to say. And remember, friend or foe, I want to know. Send me your emails. Reply Al is coming. Stay with us.